In 1960s America, there was a revolution in the waging of war. Control of conflicts moved from the generals to the politicians.
I do not find it easy to send the flower of our youth, our finest young men, into battle.
Vietnam was the bloody testing ground for this new theory. The Air Force found itself ill-equipped for such a war. It learned much, but it learned it the hard way. I'm Walter Boyne, and this is the story of the United States Air Force. The great bomber and missile fleets of the Strategic Air Command established a Pax Americana during the nervous Cold War years of the 1950s. But when a shooting war came in Southeast Asia, these mighty and terrible weapons proved to be of little use. In the early 1950s, France was the colonial power controlling the Southeast Asian territory of Indochina. The French found themselves confronting communist Vietnamese forces. The communists began to win, squeezing the French out of one position after another. When the French were trapped in a disastrous battle at Dien Bien Phu in March of 1954, they appealed for direct U.S. intervention. For a brief period, the use of U.S. atomic weapons was contemplated. In the end, nothing was done. Dien Bien Phu fell to the communist General Giap. The French were forced to leave Indochina. Under the terms of the 1954 Geneva Protocols, Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel, with the Democratic Republic of Vietnam to the north, supported by China and Russia. To the south was the Republic of Vietnam, supported by the United States. It was as if the Korean problem of the late 40s had been transplanted to Indochina. President Eisenhower recognized the elected regime of the Republic of Vietnam and promised support. He accepted the domino theory that all countries of Southeast Asia would fall one by one to the North Vietnamese if they were not checked.
In the Middle East, here at home, unassisted, Vietnam cannot, at this time, produce and support the military formations essential to it.
The United States decided to prevent the dominoes from toppling by shoring up the South Vietnamese with military equipment and training. On October 11, 1961, President Kennedy authorized the deployment of an element of the USAF Jungle Gym Combat Training Squadron to South Vietnam under the code name Farmgate. The nominal task was to train and equip the Vietnamese Air Force. The Vietnamese Air Force started with 6 squadrons and 97 ill-maintained planes in 1962. Under Farmgate, it grew to an effective force of 14 squadrons and 285 planes in 1965. But it was not enough, and never would be enough. The advisory phase mutated into direct USAF involvement. America found itself at war. In the spring of 1965, Viet Cong forces increased their activity. A mortar attack on Ben Hoa Air Base destroyed 5 Martin B-57s. There was an attack on the American embassy in Saigon. The black pajama-clad Viet Cong were now fighting regular battles with South Vietnamese forces. The U.S. reaction to Viet Cong activity was a decision to use USAF tactical air power directly. This would include bombing infiltration trails in Laos and targets in North Vietnam. The Air Force recommended that if America was forced into a contest with North Vietnam, there was a quick solution: a decisive bombing attack against 94 major industrial targets would wipe out North Vietnam's war-making capability. At that time, North Vietnam had yet to build its sophisticated defense network of surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft batteries, and MiG interceptors. The only possible way for the United States to have lost in Vietnam was to commit huge land forces. The only way it could have won was with an overwhelming airstrike.
And with your permission, therefore, I'd like to tell you something.
But by the early 60s, a whiz-kid style of micromanagement had been thrust upon the Pentagon by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. McNamara was a master of quantitative analysis, the king of the number crunchers. He could recall statistics and destroy any briefer whose information was wrong.
10 of the types of planes which are operating off our carriers today in the South China Sea, because it was then that
He believed that military equipment could be procured on the basis of statistical analysis. This belief was not shared by military professionals.
When I graduated from National War College, apparently I was a #1 draft choice, so I was drafted up on the staff of Secretary Robert McNamara, who it was said about he knew the cost of everything and the value of nothing, and I learned that very well.
It was a small step from procurement to using the same mathematically elegant techniques to conduct military operations. McNamara failed to understand that the corporate concept of a bottom line cannot be translated into the life or death considerations of military requirements. This failure would have a profound effect on America's ability to win the war.
How would they have ever won World War II if they'd had direction like that? It was, McNamara set the Air Force back 15 years, maybe 30, I don't know.
McNamara also failed to take the advice of the man who had created SAC's atomic shield, General Curtis LeMay. LeMay was now Air Force Chief of Staff, a post he did not enjoy.
And he admitted he wasn't a very good chief. It just wasn't an environment. It's a committee action, discussion back and forth. He was a marvelous commander, but he would say not a good chief. He was frustrated during that whole time period.
I'm sure you realize that.
By 1964, events all over the world could be monitored in real time in Washington, D.C. It became possible for the Commander-in-Chief to issue orders directly to the field on a day-to-day basis. It was a tempting prospect for most leaders. To Lyndon Johnson, it was irresistible.
That the people of South Vietnam shall have the right of choice, the right to shape their own destiny in free elections.
In World War II in Korea, the government had set broad policies for the military to fulfill in the conduct of military operations. But in Vietnam, the government would direct operations on a daily basis. It would prescribe targets and times of attack. It would even select the ordnance to be used.
You know, President Johnson getting personally and deeply involved in what the airplanes would take. I've been sitting on the ramp and they stopped us and changed our ordnance load, and the order came down from the White House. I mean, you can't micromanage that way.
Communications were rapid, but orders passed from the White House would have to pass through the various headquarters: the Pentagon, 13th Air Force in Hawaii, 7th Air Force, in Saigon. By the time the orders reached the battlefield, the real situation could be completely altered, often because of leaks to the Viet Cong. The results were wasted sorties and vicious ambushes. The Department of Defense and the White House established an intricate and variable set of rules of engagement. These rules subjected military action to short-term political considerations. They also used the incredible policy of graduated response, warfare by measured escalation, designed to correspond nicely to provocations.
Besides, we seek no wider war. Our response will depend upon the action of the aggressors, in this case, the North Vietnamese. The key to the situation remains the cessation of infiltration from the north.
In the comfort of Washington offices, it was determined that air operations were to deliver a political message instead of devastating damage. The war would be played by signals.
The rules that the politicians geared up for us in North Vietnam just made no sense at all. They were sending all these, they thought, subtle but profound signals that weren't, but the North Vietnamese looked on them as a sign of weakness, and they were right.
It would fall to the men and women of all services to take up the slack of abject failure of civil and military leadership. They would do the best possible job under the worst conditions, and they would find themselves reviled by the public for doing their duty.
But for whatever reason, we were there. And we had American young men there, many of which were conscriptees, 55,000 of whom gave their lives. They risked everything they had and they lost it. And I read in Mr. McNamara's book that he said, the President and I got many, many recommendations from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all of which had a paragraph about the risks involved. And in every one of them, there was the risk of intervention, the risk of attack, the risk of explosioning, the risk of that and the other. And so McNamara said, the President and I had already agreed that we weren't going to take those risks. You can't persist long in asking your young men, and now your young women, to risk everything they have in war if the nation that's putting them in that position isn't willing to share their risks.
On August 5th, 1964, North Vietnamese torpedo boats allegedly attacked U.S. ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. 2 days later, the Congress passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, granting the President greater authority to strike back against North Vietnam.
Hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
B-52s were sent to Andersen Air Force Base, Guam. KC-135 tankers were deployed to Okinawa. The B-52s were temporarily kept in reserve as a bombing operation called Rolling Thunder began in the north. The operation was flown primarily by Republic F-105 Thunder Chiefs, supersonic fighter bombers with a great load-carrying capability. The F-105 was fondly called the Thud, an ironic reference to its huge size and weight. Under America's self-imposed rules of engagement, there were some inhibiting refinements to the Rolling Thunder targets in the north. Traffic along roads, bridges, rail lines, and radar sites were eligible targets. But it was forbidden to hit surface-to-air missile sites or the MiGs visible on North Vietnamese airfields. North Vietnamese dikes damming the water for rice paddies were off limits. Consequently, the rice paddies became a favored site for North Vietnamese anti-aircraft batteries. Washington wanted the war to be contained without killing any Russian and Chinese advisors at the airfields and missile sites.
We would find an area that had all been outlined like this. You could see the ring, and the minute they drew that ring, you knew they were putting up a SAM site there. And they would put SAMs all around the ring so that if one was being attacked, the other ones would be firing at you. And we could see that they were doing that. What they were doing, they were building the SAM site, putting in the stuff, and we'd report it and request permission to attack it. Can't attack it. Might be Russian. The Russians are helping the Vietnamese, and the Russians maybe. We'd send a wire back and say, so there's a Russian there. He knows it's a combat zone. What the hell is the problem? Let us go after. Nope, that's off limits. And then a month later, that damn SAM site would be up and would be firing, and then we would get direction to go in and hit it. Now instead of taking care of it easily and not losing anybody, you go in there and probably lose at least one airplane trying to knock that whole SAM site out, and maybe not even do it.
And next thing we know, we got not only MiG-15s and 17s and 19s, we got MiG-21s in the equation, and it got to be a very sporting course.
MiGs were not to be attacked unless they showed hostile intent by turning in to make an attack of their own. Over the next 2 years, the USAF and the Navy accelerated their efforts under rolling thunder. They flew nearly 170,000 sorties. They dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs. They killed almost 30,000 civilians. In response, the hardy North Vietnamese dispersed their facilities. They increased their imports of arms, petroleum, and food from Russia and China. American bombing halted in 1968. The halt was supposed to be a signal to the communists that America was willing to negotiate.
By 1968, it was apparent that we were not there to win. We were not allowed to win. Rules of engagement, tremendous restrictions. There were times when we were fired upon, we could not fire back, airspace, border requirements. And it was extremely discouraging, particularly when we were losing people every day. We were not allowed to do what we were trained to do, what we were capable of doing, what the airplane was capable of doing.
North Vietnam used the halt to bring in Soviet equipment and Soviet advisors. They completely rejuvenated the air defense system. They built 40 surface-to-air missile sites around Hanoi alone. They brought into operation MiG-21 fighters equipped with Atoll missiles, which corresponded to the American Sidewinders. The North Vietnamese were sustaining the Viet Cong and their own regular units with supplies brought down a route known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was an intricate set of roads, rivers, and paths, shielded by a triple canopy of jungle. The trail had been used for centuries by guerrillas. The straight line distance from Saigon to Hanoi was roughly 600 miles. But the trail was many times longer than that, twisting through Laos and Cambodia, sometimes crossing into South Vietnam. Thousands of Russian-built ZIL trucks carried up to 5 tons of supplies each. Interspersed with truck convoys were bicycles with sacks of rifles and humans carrying sacks of rice.
We forlornly tried to interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was absolutely impossible, up in northern Laos and so forth. And then, of course, we did some in-country work when someone thought they knew where some Viet Cong were, and you usually end up strafing trees.
When U.S. attacks temporarily took out bridges or roadways, human labor portaged the material to the next point, indefatigable as a trail of ants scurrying with their burdens.
We couldn't operate effectively at night, So the night was the time of sanctuary for the adversary. That's the time they reconstituted, repaired, regrouped, got ready for the next day.
Defense Secretary McNamara, believing in the power of technology, authorized $2.5 billion to be invested in a system called Igloo White. Igloo White consisted in part of airdrop sensors that detected troops or trucks by acoustic or seismic means. Information was relayed to an orbiting aircraft, usually an RC-121 Constellation. It was passed on to Task Force Alpha, where it was analyzed and an appropriate strike force called up. Igloo White had defects and limitations. Chief among them was the intelligent Vietnamese response. When they spotted an acoustic sensor parachuting down, they would locate it. Then they would run a single truck back and forth near it for hours, sending a signal that implied an army was going by. Ultimately, billions would be spent. Millions of dollars of enemy supplies were destroyed. But the net total arriving in the hands of the Viet Cong steadily increased. Just as in Korea, public interest in the war centered around the air-to-air combat with Russian and Chinese-built MiG fighters. But in Vietnam, there was no longer a 10-to-1 victory ratio. The ratio between 1965 and 1967 was about 3.5 to 1. From late 1967 to 1968, it fell to 2 to 1. The truth was that U.S. pre-war combat training had not been vigorous enough. There had been too much concern about flying safety and not enough about simulating the rigors of battle. As a result of tougher training after 1968, the USAF victory ratio climbed to 3 to 1, but it was still nowhere near the Korean War ratio. Nor was it equivalent to the startling 13 to 1 ratio established in 1972 by the Navy as a result of the training in the Top Gun program. A number of factors led to the Air Force's low victory-to-loss ratio. One of the most important was that the North Vietnamese People's Air Force was strictly controlled from the ground. It refused combat under all but the most favorable circumstances.
They like to get supersonic, either high or low, fire their ATOL heat-seeking missile, and dive away. And they learned that they didn't want to get in close.
The McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom was undoubtedly the best fighter during the 1960s, and in many ways was suited to the Vietnam War. It had long range and could refuel in flight. It was fast and could carry a heavy load.
In an airplane like the Phantom, that had equipment in the back seat that was not in the front seat, that was designed to be operated by 2 people, it was a definite advantage to have 2 people under those conditions. Highly trained, both highly trained, and to be able to fly as a team all the time. Chuck DeBellevue and I flew over 100 sorties together. Chuck was the best of any of the backseaters at UDARN, and I was very fortunate to be able to select him to fly with me. We got to the point that we didn't have to say a lot to each other in the cockpit. I knew what Chuck needed, he knew exactly what I needed.
What the early Phantom could not do was dogfight effectively with the MiGs.
And the F-4 was not a dogfight machine. That was a big, huge monster with a tremendous amount of power, and it turned like a sewer cover.
The MiGs were usually able to spot the larger F-4s first. Sometimes they would pop up from behind to fire a missile from the 6 o'clock position, then dive away.
Well, the MiG-21 was small, hard to see. It left very little smoke trail. It had a lower wing loading, which meant that it turned tighter than we, very important in an air battle. The F-4, in comparison, large, bulky. We left 2 big smoke trails when we were not in afterburner, so a flight of 4 could be seen 20 miles away.
Dogfighting was also hampered because the first F-4s to reach Vietnam were armed only with missiles, originally intended for use against enemy bombers. Some pilots, like Ace Steve Ritchie, had success with missiles.
The MiG was in a high G turn. The first missile went through the center of the fuselage of the MiG, and the second missile went through the fireball. And on the second MiG, I only fired one missile because I thought we were out of parameters. We were too close, the angle was too great, and we had another absolutely perfect missile.
But often, the F-4's missiles were no help.
The 7th Air Force rule was you had to close on him until you could visually identify him, and then by that time you're inside the range of the Sparrow missile. Most of the time you might even be inside the range of the infrared missile. And so what you're left with now is a gun situation, and there's no gun on the F-4.
As a quick fix, rapid-firing gun pods were mounted on a centerline attachment point.
That 20-millimeter gun and put a round about every 6 inches, and we come in there with two of those guns and just run the whole length of them, and just the boat, you could just see the boat. It would do like that, it would just fall apart, you know, just cut it right in two.
Between 1968 and 1972, there was virtually no air-to-air combat. Instead of fighting MiGs, the F-4s were turned into bombers and escort fighters. The F-4 was often used in combination with the Republic F-105 Thunder Chief. A long series of accidents early in its life made the F-105 notorious. But in Vietnam, it became the supreme fighter bomber. It was the fastest aircraft in the theater. It was able to streak through the tough North Vietnamese defenses, drop its bombs, then, if necessary, dogfight its way out, using its internal gun to kill the MiGs. The Republic F-105 was a huge aircraft weighing more than 50,000 pounds. Affectionately called the Thud, its speed and power made it the workhorse of the Vietnam War. There it flew more than 75% of the missions over the North. This particular aircraft, Memphis Belle II, was a tough customer. On its tour, it shot down 2 MiGs.
We quickly found that we could, with conventional weapons and using some of the techniques that those of us who had had the opportunity to use in Korea were still familiar with and could teach and get other people to do. Using those techniques with conventional, dirty old 750-pound iron bombs, 6 of them hung underneath the belly, or 2,000-pounders on the wing, that we could do extremely precise bombing work with that airplane.
We're getting flack south of target one. Watch it.
When the bombing of Hanoi was authorized, the mission became known as going downtown. The Thuds led the way, both in bombing and in casualties.
Eagle flag, a lot of flag out south of that middle side. Roger, let's go get it.
The Thud crews had only a 50% chance of surviving a 100-mission tour.
I'm right over the target right now. I've got a 17 right in front of him.
I can only describe it as the most eerie sensation I have ever had in my life. Between my wingman and myself, a guy named John Bobel, all of a sudden there is a roar that's beyond description, and incandescent light that just goes in through your eyes and right down to your stomach. It paralyzes everything. 2 SAMs came up between John and myself, and we're perhaps 50 yards apart.
Thuds and F-4s shared one of the most dangerous and most vital missions of the war. The task of the Wild Weasel mission was to suppress surface-to-air missiles. In North Vietnam, Wild Weasel teams would seek out SAM sites by offering themselves as targets. When the SAM radars illuminated them, the Wild Weasel aircraft would launch radar-homing missiles to destroy the radar sites.
Okay, keep turning left. Okay. A little out now, he's strong. Wide. Okay, I got that man. Okay, Detroit, let's get out of here to the southwest.
By the time we'd We're halfway through my operation with Rolling Thunder. If you had to go in without ECM pod, or if you didn't have a Weasel flight along, you felt quite persecuted.
The Wild Weasel mission was an incredibly hazardous, nerve-wracking job. Weasels would remain on station as the attackers left the target area, earning their motto, first in, last out. A much larger, older, and more unlikely aircraft became a major player in Vietnam. The Boeing XB-52 made its first flight on April 14, 1952. It was intended as a high-altitude nuclear bomber, capable of single-plane missions to the heart of the Soviet Union. No one in the Air Force or at Boeing would have predicted that 20 years later, it would still be in use in Vietnam as an aerial artillery platform, flying in formation and dropping conventional iron bombs. At 30,000 feet, the B-52s were unseen and unheard from the ground. Their threat forced the enemy to break up its ground elements, spreading them out so that they would not be caught in a carpet of bombs. For the B-52 crews, life was a monotonous round of briefing, flying, and sleeping. There was a sense of remoteness to their actions that combined with tension, fatigue, and boredom to erode crew morale. Crew members mockingly called themselves coconut knockers for the hours they spent bombing the jungle. But the B-52s were reputedly the weapon most feared by the Viet Cong. By 1968, the United States was aware that it had to disengage from Vietnam. Secret negotiations between the U.S. and the North Vietnamese were intended to provide a framework in which the war would be Vietnamized. South Vietnamese forces would be so trained and strengthened that they would not require U.S. support. America could wash its hands of a war it had never wanted. On October 23, 1972, all bombing was halted north of the 20th parallel. But the North Vietnamese took advantage of the cessation of bombing to repair railroads and bridges, gearing up for a major assault on the South. U.S. President Nixon decided to attack the enemy so vigorously that it would prefer to negotiate rather than continue the endless guerrilla warfare. The attack was to be called Linebacker 2. The artificial rules of engagement were lifted. Linebacker 2 started with a B-52 attack on Hanoi and Haiphong. The enemy defenses were heavy, but the Strategic Air Command flew 729 sorties in 11 days, dropping 15,000 tons of bombs and losing only 15 airplanes. By the 11th day, North Vietnamese opposition had been hammered into the ground. There were no more SAMs to be fired and no sites to fire them from. The North Vietnamese returned to the negotiating table, forced there by Linebacker 2. Among the unsung heroes of the war were the crews of the Boeing KC-135 tankers that refueled the attack aircraft in flight. The KC-135s were in effect a force multiplier. They doubled and redoubled the value of the fighters and the B-52s. The extreme danger of aerial refueling is often overlooked. The tanker is 300,000 pounds of fuel and metal moving at 500 miles an hour. It must make a rendezvous and then the gentlest of collisions with an equally swift mass of metal and fuel. The night operations and turbulent thunderstorms of Vietnam, the radio silence, and the minimum lights added to the hazard. Tankers allowed fighters to take off with heavy armament loads, topping them up with fuel once they were airborne. Then the tankers would orbit, waiting to refuel the fighters on their way back from the mission. Sometimes they would use their booms to tow damaged fighters within gliding distance of their bases. In the course of the war, the KC-135s made more than 800,000 refuelings, offloading almost 9 billion pounds of fuel. The rewards for this hard, hazardous, unrelenting work were mainly psychological. A fighter pilot might say, "Thanks, you can count that as a save," as he broke away. But for the tanker, he would have had to abandon his aircraft. A tanker crewman rarely had to buy his own drinks on a fighter base. In Vietnam, visual reconnaissance assumed the importance it had gained in World War I. The intimate nature of war in Vietnam, brothers fighting against brothers in their own villages, made visual reconnaissance absolutely critical. But the USAF could not select its own targets from reconnaissance photos. That was the responsibility of the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. The MACV also determined the time, location, and manner of reconnaissance missions. Despite these command difficulties, the reconnaissance crews continued to plunge unarmed into hotly defended zones to bring back essential photographs. The most intimate of all forms of reconnaissance in the war was the forward air controller.
Negative, let's go straight ahead. I'll go to a left-hand open now. Okay, we got
The FAC had to ensure that a target was in fact the enemy, and that friendly personnel and installations were not damaged. The only way to do this was to fly low and slow in the combat area, vulnerable to everything from a thrown rock to anti-aircraft fire. For much of the war, the FAC flew unarmed light aircraft like Cessna 01s.
Okay, real fine. Okay, 6-1, I'd like you to put your bomb just short of 2.
He had to find the target, call for fighter bombers, mark the targets, and control the attack. All this, and the ability to assess damage, called for extreme skill and courage. Later in the war, fast forward air controllers, jet F-100s and F-4s, conducted fast reconnaissance in high-threat areas. Only the most experienced veterans, in first-class physical condition, could withstand the 4 to 5 hours of low-level flight and high G turns demanded by this mission. It was service at the sharp end of the stick, as valuable for saving innocent lives as for hitting the target. Strategic airlift was more important in Vietnam than it was in either World War II or Korea. Neither the harbors nor the roads of Vietnam permitted timely unloading of ships. 34 squadrons of the Military Airlift Command were dedicated to airlift. Initially, most of the aircraft used were obsolete Douglas C-124s. The first major boost to cargo capability was the Lockheed C-141 in 1965. It could carry twice the C-124's cargo, twice as fast and twice as far. In 1969, the controversial Lockheed C-5A became operational. Ultimately, 73 of these giants saw service. Tactical airlift in Vietnam came into its own with the arrival of the Lockheed C-130 Hercules, an immensely strong 4-engine turboprop. The transports operated routinely in the combat zone. Some analysts have written that tactical airlift was more important in Vietnam than the interdiction provided by tactical fighters. Transports carried men and cargo to the scene of battle. They were used in major parachute assaults. It was back-breaking, knuckle-biting work, and it went on routinely, day after day. From 1967 to 1973, tactical airlift carried more than 7 million tons of passengers and cargo within South Vietnam, almost 10 times the total carried during the Korean War. One of the most potent weapons of the Vietnam War, the side-firing gunship, was derived from transport aircraft. Equipped with cannon and gun ports, the aerial gunship was a joint product of inspiration and desperation. The theory was that the pilot would make pylon turns, sighting his wingtip on a point on the ground and circling around it. Guns in the side of the aircraft could be sighted accurately on the relatively stationary target. There were plenty of C-47s around to be converted as gunships. The AC-47 gunships came to be called Spooky, or Dragon Ship, or Puff, inspired by the song Puff the Magic Dragon, referring to the outpouring of flame and smoke when the guns were fired. Demand for gunships increased, and faster, more modern aircraft were selected for conversion. Among them was the Lockheed AC-130. Like an ancient ship of the line, the Lockheed Martin AC-130 is truly an angel of death. It bristles with side-firing weapons, from the 20-millimeter Gatling guns to the 7.62 miniguns to the 40-millimeter cannon. Taken together, their volume of fire makes it a dominant battlefield weapon. The gunships were extremely cost-effective in terms of the numbers of trucks destroyed and the number of lives saved in defending villages and ports. It was lonely, dangerous work, but rewards for saving forces on the ground or destroying enemy supplies were immediate and apparent. Vietnam veterans, once the object of contempt in the eyes of a small but vocal part of the community, are now seen as the heroes they were, men and women who are trying to do their duty. Of all the missions in Vietnam, the one that best captures the spirit of good intent is that of the search and rescue teams. They risk their lives day in and day out for their motto, so that others may live. By 1968, every aircrew member flying in Southeast Asia knew that if he went down, every effort would be made to rescue him, regardless of location, cost, or impact on other missions.
And most people would have broken all of the rules. They would have done anything possible to rescue a downed colleague.
It was not until November 1964, after more than 20 aircraft had crashed or had been shot down, that the first official trained search and rescue capability became available. Eventually, standard rescue teams used Douglas A-1E Sky Raiders, known in Vietnam as Sandys, as armed escorts. The job of the Sandys was to put down suppressing fire, to keep the enemy away from the downed aircrew while the helicopters went in to make the rescue.
Okay, as soon as you two get through, go out and pick up the jollies and bring them in. Sandy 3, roger, we're on our way over. Follow me, Jolly, follow me.
In 1965, the Sikorsky HH-3E helicopter, the Jolly Green Giant, was introduced. The rescue helicopters endured everything from attacks by MiGs to running the gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire.
Hold your hover. Taking out the slack. Hold your hover. Hold your hover. Hold your hover. 10 foot below the aircraft. 10 foot below the aircraft. Hold your hover, babe. Hold your hover. 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 Survivors at the door. Survivors coming in the door. Survivors in and secure. Let's get the hell out of here. Okay, talk to me. We're coming out. Go on, coming out, Sandy. Coming out. Okay, ready ahead. Down that valley and get low. Get low. Get low and follow that valley, Jolly.
In the last search and rescue operation of the war, Air Force and Marine helicopters flew mission after mission to ferry out South Vietnamese patriots who dare not face the communist occupiers. The United States Air Force entered the war in Southeast Asia when it was ordered to do so. It withdrew in the same way.
In 8 years of the air war, we never really won air superiority. We would have air superiority conditional at times and places, but in terms of a general air superiority, in 8 years, we never won air superiority.
It has nothing to do with whether we were there, whether we should have been there. We were there, and we fought the war in the wrong way. And we shouldn't hazard our people like that. That's primitive. That's the kind of conflict they did in the Dark Ages when armies slaughtered each other. 55,000 young men that didn't have to die.
As senseless as the entire intervention had been, there were lessons to be learned from it.
Make no mistake, we came out of the Vietnam War with an enormously deeply embedded, almost burned into our souls, set of lessons about our inadequacies. That is, about the deficiencies in our ability to do what we thought air power would be able to do and what we certainly knew air power should be able to do.
The politicized command structure that had been such a disaster would change. A new group of leaders would emerge, well-grounded in the advanced technologies and tactics of the time. As a result of the tough and often bitter experience of Vietnam, they would be better equipped to face the battles of the future.